the Derringer's cold steel pressed against Rebecca. Harrison's thigh as Big Mike Garrett's whiskey-soaked breath curled around her face. 6 men stood in a rough circle, their eyes gleaming with the hunger that came from 3 years of imagining what the lonely widow might look like beneath her fine dresses. Outside, thunder rolled across the Arizona desert, trapping her in Tombstone for the night tandem with her. "Been wondering what a woman like you does all alone on that big ranch," Mike slurred, his meaty hand reaching for her waist. "Reckon it's time someone showed you how a real man treats a lady." Rebecca's gloved fingers brushed the hem of her emerald silk skirt, finding the small weight hidden there. The Derringer pearl-handled, deadly, and deceptively feminine rested against her thigh. Across the smoky room, a young cowboy's jaw tightened, his hand moving instinctively toward his Colt. The air inside the Silver Dollar Saloon was electric, charged with more than the approaching storm. What happened next would change 3 lives forever. It had been 3 long years since Thomas Harrison's heart gave out on a cattle drive, leaving Rebecca with 2,000 acres of prime grazing land and a town full of men who measured her worth by her loneliness. At 38, she carried herself with the calm grace of a woman who had learned to survive in a world that treated widows as saints or sinners, and Tombstone had precious little patience for saints. The Circle H Ranch lay 8 miles southeast of town, far enough for privacy but close enough for gossip to ride the desert wind. Rebecca had kept the ranch alive through sheer willpower, and the Derringer, her husband, had given her on their wedding day. "A lady's gun," Thomas had said, pressing it into her palm, "but it'll put a man down just as dead as a dot for 5 now." Storm clouds blackened the sky as she guided her chestnut mare through Tombstone's muddy streets. She'd come for supplies, but the weather had other plans. By dusk, rain hammered down in silver sheets, and respectability was a luxury she couldn't afford. The Silver Dollar was no place for a proper woman, but it was dry. Inside, tobacco smoke clung to the rafters. Laughter and piano notes tangled in the air, and the scent of whiskey mixed with the sweetness of perfume. Rebecca took a corner table, her emerald dress fine silk from better days drawing eyes like honey draws flies. She ordered coffee, black and strong, and pretended not to feel the stares crawling across her skin. That was when Big Mike Garrett noticed her. "Hell," he said loudly, pushing back his chair with a grunt. "Look what the storm blew in." The saloon quieted. Mike was a big man, with bigger ambitions, owner of Tombstone's largest mercantile and half the mining claims in the Whetstone Mountains. What he wanted, he usually got, and he'd been wanting Rebecca Harrison for a long time. "Evening, Mr. Garrett," she said coolly. Her fingers brushed the Derringer's smooth handle through her skirt. "Just waiting out the storm." "Course you are." His boots thudded on the floor as he approached, his 5 companions forming a half circle behind him. Must get mighty lonely out there on them winter nights. The other patrons melted into the shadows, unwilling to intervene. Only one man didn't. He sat alone at a corner table, lean as a whip, sun-weathered, his eyes the color of winter sky. He watched in silence, the coiled stillness of a man used to violence. "I managed just fine," Rebecca said, rising to leave. Mike's hand shot out, catching her wrist. The smell of sweat and tobacco filled her nostrils. "Now, don't be rude, darling. We're just being neighborly." The Derringer appeared in her hand as if conjured from air, its twin barrels centered on Mike's chest. The metallic click of the hammer echoed through the saloon, louder than the thunder outside. "Back off." Her voice carried the authority of a woman who'd faced Russell's drought and death and won. "Or I'll put a hole in you smaller than your brain." The silence that followed was taut as a drawn bow. Mike's face twisted through surprise, anger, and something like reluctant admiration. His companions hesitated, unwilling to test the woman's nerve. "This ain't over," Mike growled, stepping back, palms raised in mock surrender. "It only takes one shot," Rebecca said, the Derringer never wavering, The crowd parted as she strode toward the door, her silk skirts whispering against her legs. The storm outside felt almost gentle compared to the one she'd just weathered. But in the corner, the young cowboy saw the truth, the faint tremble in her hand as she holstered the weapon, the flicker of vulnerability beneath her hard composure. Her courage stirred something deep in him, a protective instinct honed by years of battle and loss. Dawn broke over Tombstone like the edge of a knife, slicing through the storm's remnants. Dan Carter was already at the livery stable, tightening his saddle cinch on a roan gelding. 29, sun-browned, and quiet as a shadow, he carried the discipline of a man who'd seen too much. 5 years in the 6th Cavalry had taught him to ride hard, shoot straight, and never leave good people defenseless. The memory of the widow in green silk, steady, fearless, defiant, had followed him through the night. By sunrise, he'd made a decision. He was riding east. The Circle H ranch sat in a valley of red rock and pale sagebrush, the kind of land that made men covet and kill. Rebecca emerged from the house as he approached, her morning dress cotton instead of silk, but no less striking. She carried herself differently, here stronger, freer, as if the open land gave her back what the town had stolen. "You're trespassing," she called, though her tone held curiosity, not anger. Don tipped his hat. "Ma'am, name's Daniel Carter. I'm looking for work." Rebecca studied him, his worn clothes, the calloused hands, the steady way he held himself. "Funny coincidence. Most men who see me in town decide they need employment come morning." "Yes, ma'am," he said simply. "I expect they do." Something in his honesty disarmed her. No flattery, no excuses, just quiet truth. "Can you work cattle?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am. Break horses, fix fence, mend roofs, handle trouble." "Too. Trouble," she repeated. "Ma'am, I spent 5 years keeping the peace in Apache country. Trouble don't scare me." Rebecca's lips quirked faintly. $30 a month, meals included. "You try anything improper, you'll meet the business end of my derringer." Dan's mouth curved into a ghost of a smile. "Wouldn't dream of it, ma'am." Still, when he dismounted, she couldn't help noticing the easy strength in his stride, the confident grace of a man who knew his own power. Hiring him, she suspected, might be either the smartest or most dangerous decision she'd ever made. The first month passed like dry grass catching flames, low, steady, unstoppable. Dan worked from dawn till dusk, his quiet competence speaking louder than words. He gentled horses with patience instead of force. He repaired miles of fence and treated every creature, human or animal, with respect. Evenings became the dangerous time. Rebecca would bring coffee to the bunkhouse porch, and conversation would flow like creek water, effortless and steady. He spoke of Kentucky hills green as velvet, of cavalry raids and nights when death rode close beside him. She told him of Philadelphia society, of a marriage built on practicality that somehow had grown into affection. "I never got to choose," she admitted one evening, her coffee cooling in her hands. "Thomas was a good man, but it was ... arranged, practical." Dan's gaze met hers. "Practical's fine, ma'am," he said softly, "but it ain't everything." Their eyes lingered longer than they should have. Something in her chest tightened, an ache she hadn't felt in years. Rebecca Harrison had spent 3 years keeping her heart locked away, but Daniel Carter looked at her as no man ever had, not as property, not as prey, but as a woman worth understanding, and that realization was more dangerous than any gun in Tombstone. The first sign of trouble came quietly. Dan Carter found fresh hoofprints near the north pasture, too close to the ranch house to be travelers just passing through. The second was subtler, a broken gate latch that looked pried, not weathered. The third came in Rebecca's eyes whenever she rode to town. She hid it well, but he saw it, the flicker of unease she couldn't quite disguise. "Something's got you spooked," Dan said one evening, leaning against a porch post as the last light bled out of the sky. Rebecca paced the porch, arms crossed. Mike Garrett's been sending men out here. First with offers to buy the ranch, then to check the fences, she said, her voice sharp with bitterness. He thinks if he keeps reminding me how alone I am, I'll give in. Dan's eyes went cold, like river ice. He's wrong. But both of them knew that courage had limits. Tombstone had always sided with power, and Mike Garrett had plenty money, men, and the ear of the sheriff. The Circle H ranch stood proud, but pride could get a woman killed out here. That night, lightning danced over the Dragoon Mountains, white fire against the black sky. Dan lay awake in the bunkhouse, listening to the thunder roll. He could feel the storm building, not the one in the heavens, but the one headed straight for Rebecca Harrison. He was right. It happened on a Tuesday morning. Rebecca was in the barn, tending to a lame mare, when she heard the thunder of hoofbeats. Too many, too fast. Her blood turned cold. She peered through the open barn door, just as 6 riders swept into the yard, dust rising behind them like smoke. Big Mike Garrett led the pack, broad-shouldered and smug, his slick smile cutting through the wind. "Afternoon, Rebecca," he called, dismounting with the confidence of a man who believed himself invincible. "Fine day for a little talk about your future." Rebecca straightened, hay dust clinging to her skirt. "I'm not interested in conversation." "Course you're not," Mike said icily, stepping closer. His men fanned out in a half-circle, blocking her escape. "But I figure we're past talking." Her fingers slid beneath her skirt, finding the Derringer's familiar weight. 2 bullets. Not nearly enough. But she raised it anyway, her heart hammering. "Turn around, Mike," she warned. "You and your men are trespassing." He laughed, deep and cruel. "Darlin', the only thing you own out here is what men let you keep." His laughter died with the sound of a gunshot. Mike's hat flew from his head, spinning into the dust. The riders froze. On the ridge above the ranch, a lone figure sat astride a roan horse, smoke curling from the barrel of his Colt .45. Dan Carter. "That was a warning," he shouted, his voice carrying across the valley. "Next one won't be." Son of a Mike spun toward his men. "Get him." But Daniel Carter had been a cavalryman once. He didn't wait for orders to be given twice. He spurred his gelding down the slope, firing as he rode, a blur of motion and thunder. The first bullet caught one of Mike's men in the shoulder, spinning him out of his saddle. Another dropped his rifle before he could aim. Rebecca took her chance. She stepped from the barn, skirts snapping in the wind, and fired her Derringer twice. One man fell. Another yelped as a bullet grazed his leg. Then the gun clicked empty. Now she was exposed. Mike's face twisted with rage. He drew his revolver and stalked toward her. "You're gonna pay for that, woman." Before he could fire, Dan's horse crashed into him, knocking the gun from his hand. The 2 men hit the ground hard, rolling in the dirt. Dan came up first, his face streaked with sweat and blood, his Colt raised. The yard was chaos, horses screaming, men shouting, gunfire cracking like lightning. But Dan moved through it with the precision of a soldier. 1 shot, 2, 3, each measured, deliberate, deadly. When the dust cleared, Mike Garrett was the only one left standing. Barely. He stared at Dan, chest heaving, disbelief warring with hatred. "You think this is over?" he spat, blood flecking his chin. "You can't protect her forever." Dan cocked the Colt, his voice low and calm. "Watch me." For a heartbeat, neither moved. Then Mike backed away, fear finally creeping into his eyes. He mounted his horse, turned, and rode off into the desert, his remaining men limping after him. The sound of hoofbeats faded into silence, leaving only the rasp of Rebecca's breathing and the buzz of desert cicadas. Don holstered his weapon and turned toward her. "You all right, ma'am?" Rebecca stared at him, her heart still hammering. "You're bleeding." He looked down. A thin ribbon of crimson was soaking through his sleeve. "It's nothing." But she was already moving toward him, her hands shaking from adrenaline and something else she didn't dare name. "Come inside." Now, the ranch house felt different with Dan in it. Smaller somehow. Charged with the energy of everything that had just happened and everything that might. Rebecca led him to the sitting room, her skirts swishing against his legs. "Sit," she ordered, voice husky. "Let me see." Dan sank into a chair, wincing as she helped him out of his torn shirt. The wound was shallow, a grazing bullet, but it still bled. She fetched whiskey, bandages, and a clean rag, kneeling beside him as she worked. Her touch was firm, efficient, but her pulse raced every time her fingers brushed his skin. The lamplight caught on his chest, bronzed and scarred from old battles. He smelled of gunpowder and horse sweat and raw, dangerous man. Rebecca's breath trembled. For years she'd trained herself not to look, not to want, but tonight, the walls she'd built began to crack. "You're staring," Dan said quietly, eyes glinting with something between amusement and hunger. "I'm appreciating," she replied, voice low. "It's been a long time since I've had reason to appreciate much about a man." Dan's throat worked as he swallowed hard. "Mrs. Harrison, Rebecca," she interrupted, "after what happened today, I think we've earned first names." Silence stretched between them, heavy with all the things they hadn't said. Her hand rested on his shoulder, feeling the solid heat of him beneath her palm. His eyes darkened. "Rebecca," he murmured, her name soft as a prayer. When his fingers brushed her cheek, she didn't pull away. He traced the line of her jaw, down to her lips, and she leaned into his touch. Closing her eyes, "You ever wonder," she whispered, "why men only notice what's under a woman's skirt?" Dan's lips curved slightly. "Depends on the woman," he said, his voice rough. "Sometimes it's not just the danger under there that draws a man in. It's the courage." Her laugh was soft, trembling. "So which is it for you, Mr. Carter? The danger or the courage?" "Both," he said simply, "but mostly the woman holding the gun." And then he kissed her. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't polite. It was years of loneliness meeting years of restraint, fire meeting flint. Rebecca's hands tangled in his hair as he pulled her close, his good arm wrapping around her waist. The kiss deepened, fierce and aching, until she could no longer tell where her heartbeat ended and his began. When they finally broke apart, breathless, the lamplight flickered between them like the desert wind itself held its breath. Rebecca's voice trembled. "You risked your life for me." Dan's thumb brushed her lips. "Reckon it wasn't much of a risk," he said softly. "You were worth it." Outside, the storm had passed. The desert was silent again, washed clean by rain and gunfire alike. Rebecca rose, her hand lingering on Dan's shoulder. "You'll need rest," she said, though her voice was unsteady. "That wound," he caught her hand, holding it gently. "I'll heal, Rebecca. You should know by now, I don't scare easy." She smiled faintly, though her heart ached with something fierce and unfamiliar. "Neither do I." Their eyes met hers, still storm-dark, his cool and steady. Something passed between them, unspoken but undeniable. A promise, a beginning. Outside, the moon broke through the clouds, silvering the desert. Inside the Circle H ranch house, two survivors of the frontier, one scarred by loss, the other by war, sat in the flickering glow of lamplight, knowing the Arizona territory would never be the same again. Because sometimes, the most dangerous thing in the Wild West wasn't a gun or a storm, it was love.